to give you a sense of what you're going to hear today. So Dr. Bale is a professor of pharmacology, and she is also the director of the Center for Epigenetic Research in Child Health and Brain Development in the School of Medicine at the University of Maryland in Baltimore. She completed her PhD at the University of Washington in the Department of Pharmacology and her postdoctoral work at the Salk Institute with Dr. Wally Vale, who is a world-famous endocrinologist. Dr. Bale was professor of neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania for 15 years prior to joining the University of Maryland. Her research focuses on the translational understanding of the role of stress dysfunction in neurodevelopment and neuropsychiatric disorders, as well as the sex differences that underlie disease vulnerability in humans through the utilization of preclinical mouse models. She's interested in developing models of stress and adversity across the lifespan, including mechanism at the germ cell level involved in altering neurodevelopment. Dr. Bale's lab utilizes information from these preclinical mouse models, attempting to translate these research findings into the hope that at some point we'll have biomarkers that are important for promoting not just disease risk, but also resilience, especially in vulnerable populations. In her leadership role as the center director, Dr. Bale works to engage the Baltimore community, developing local collaborations and partnerships with local organizations, health officials, including social workers and policymakers, including those working in the Baltimore City Council. In a translational approach, Dr. Bale's center does something very rare, and she needs to be complimented. The center actually brings neuroscience research and outcomes into the community. Partnering with the Baltimore City schools and staff, families, and community leaders, Dr. Bale's center provides a lens through which policy, education, and the community can be viewed, focusing on the lasting and significant impacts and effects across generations of trauma, discrimination, and violence. Dr. Bale's work is not just important, but critical to this moment. This moment when we have an experience in COVID, Black Lives Matter, and all of the different forces across the world that are bringing us sometimes further apart, but hopefully together in certain ways. And we know that this research will help us understand more clearly what's going on across different groups. She also serves on many internal and external advisory committees, panels, and boards. She has been the recipient of numerous awards for her research in the areas including the Richard Weitzman Memorial Award from the Endocrine Society, the Medtronics Award from the Society of Women's Health Research for outstanding research that has led to the improvement of women's health, the Daniel Efron Award from the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology, and now she's the president of the International Brain Research Organization, better known as IBRO to all of us. She was recently awarded Top 100 Women in Maryland 2020. Help me welcome Dr. Bale to the World of Women in Neuroscience. Dr. Bale?
Well, Jean, that was amazing. So I don't think I have anything left to say. So
I'm sure you do. I absolutely can't wait.
It's going to be actually the fastest webinar ever. So thank you all so much. And I have to say, of all the different things I do in my day, I'm the most excited about doing this and being here with you all, because I know, just looking at all of the representation we have for the World Women of Neuroscience, this is fabulously amazing to get everybody together who is interested and coming from different viewpoints, different resource allocation, different perspectives. I mean, this is what we're supposed to be doing. This is exactly what, and so it's super exciting. I have been fortunate as president of IBRO to be able to work a lot with Emmeline and Jean over the last year or two, and really trying to figure out the alignment, which is so strong between IBRO and WWN. And so again, I'm so thankful for the privilege to be able to work with you all. I hope that this can be a discussion, an ongoing discussion. I was tasked with doing a little bit of my personal story of a woman in neuroscience and traveling, but I feel like Jean's already done a lot of that. So we can skip through all of that. And then a little bit of science and sort of how the center that I run here, as well as being president of IBRO, how all of that comes together to really think about the science that we do, what questions that we're asking, and how we're ensuring that the most vulnerable populations are being included in those perspectives, both in who's doing the research, who the research impacts, and how we're all getting together to discuss the research. I think those are all critical factors that I realize I'm really preaching to the choir with this group, that you are all aware of that. But I hope, because I, like all of you, I'm tired of talking at screens. And so rather than listening to crickets on the other end, I hope that you will interrupt and ask questions or add to the discussion. Please don't hesitate at all. I very much welcome that. So with that, and again, to say a big thank you for inviting me. I'm very honored to be part of this group. Is there a question? No? Okay. All right. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to get started. But again, please do not hesitate to interrupt. All right. So I decided to title this presentation "Experience is Everything," because I think it encompasses all that we all around the world as human beings, as scientists, as community members, as family members, that our experiences guide our perspectives and the lens that we look through. And it changes, of course, over the different experiences across our lifetimes that we have. But it also very much affects if your parents or how your parents experienced diversity and inclusion and trauma, et cetera, and then how you as a parent may pass those effects on. And so I thought that was an appropriate title. So I found this on the web last night when I was thinking about how to frame this, and that how our experiences shape the lenses that we look through for all of the perspectives of our lives. And so this cartoon, I think, is a good demonstration, depending on where you are. If you are in a good place in life, where you have access to resources, right? We're all exposed to the stress of COVID, for sure. But depending on where your baseline is, where you are on the proverbial hill and what your view is, you may more or less or more differently affected than by COVID, the additional stress. So where was your baseline to begin with? What are you currently struggling with in your community, in your personal life, in your professional life, when you add stresses on? And it very much shapes how we look at how other people are interacting with us, how we're interacting with our teammates, our family members, et cetera. And so looking at just the perspective of our lives and how experience shapes, depending on where you grew up, who you've been exposed to, how much you've traveled, what your job is, has a big impact. I will say as an American that this has become really so clear to me throughout the Trump era, that it is very easy to have a different lens that you're looking at outcomes through when you've been isolated. You've basically lived in a small town in the middle of the Midwest, and you've not been experienced any of the diversity or the hurdles or the exclusion that others have. It's very easy to define what's happening as bad choices or making bad choices, et cetera, as opposed to seeing the generations of discrimination and trauma and violence that have led to the changes and opportunities, right? So that's a different lens, how you're viewing things. And I think it's so important, and I've learned a lot about our obligation as scientists to ensure that that perspective, that experience, how it changes your viewpoint and how it can be passed across generations. If we're not out discussing this in the public, we're doing a huge disservice as to the science that we're all interested in. Okay, so just quickly, my personal story as how I came to this point, and my lens is this is a map of the United States in the upper left here. That red state, for those who aren't familiar with the Midwest, which many of you are probably not, is Minnesota. Minnesota is the land of 10,000 lakes. It is full of predominantly Scandinavian descent individuals, although some German, and it's gained a little bit in diversity probably in the last few decades. But when I was growing up, It was really a very Scandinavian driven. My grandparents are from Norway and Denmark, as are Swedish, Denmark, Norwegian, very much landed in this area. And so it's a lot of farming, especially in the southern part of the state. And that was my lens. That was how I grew up. It was hugely, I would say, Catholic, Lutheran, and very white. Very, very white. That was the interaction, the lens that I had. And so this is in the center here is the state itself, where that red, that's the county where I grew up. So very southern Minnesota, and the population of the town I grew up in, that's actually it was actually even smaller than that when I grew up. So very small town. And my experiences were very much based upon just the local community and that perspective, which of course is very limited and narrow. The most exciting thing happening in Pine Island, Minnesota was the annual Cheese Festival. And I'm not kidding you, it was actually called the Cheese Festival. And that was, the community was very, very small. The biggest thing we had going for was being known as the world's largest 6,000 pound cheese. And that was back in 1911. So life was simple and easy in a very different perspective from how I grew up and the lens that I looked through as to what the world entailed. And so as I went through college and becoming more and more interested in science, and then getting my college degree still in the state of Minnesota, I then moved out to Seattle, Washington, another state in the US, very Pacific Northwest, a very different place than the Midwest. If not for the weather being just rain, a lot of rain in Seattle, if you haven't been there, but a beautiful, beautiful city, much more diverse than the Midwest. And so I did my PhD at the University of Washington, as Dr. King said. And after completing my PhD in this very diverse, Seattle is an area that's all about community. It's all about ensuring access to resources. It's still predominantly white, I will say, but in terms of viewing through a lens of inclusion, that city is very liberal. And that was something that my experience in graduate school really opened my eyes to a lot of the issues and hurdles faced by many in the community. I left Seattle and I moved down to San Diego, which I know many of you have been to San Diego. That's in Southern California, to the Salk Institute, where I did my postdoc work with Wiley Vale. San Diego has its own issues that are very different from the rest of the country. It's Southern California, so also predominantly white, but has a large Hispanic population because it is so in close proximity to Mexico. And so there are a lot of immigrant issues that San Diego faces. And so that added to my lens of the perspective of how these families deal with the lack of resources, because many of them have been in the country illegally, whether it's just the parents and then how that impacts the children, how it impacts resources that they have access to. It's a very wide area that does not have a lot of public transportation, for instance. How do these individuals who don't necessarily have access to cars, how do they make it to medical appointments, et cetera? So that was another additional aspect that built on my lens that I viewed the communities at large and the lack of resources. I then was recruited as an assistant professor to the University of Pennsylvania, which is an Ivy League institution in the US. So it's one of those top tier institutions with billions of dollars of resources and grant dollars. Almost anything that you want to do is available to you in that environment. But it's in the city of Philadelphia, and that is in the Northeast, the city of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, very close to New York City, and north of where I live now in Baltimore. And the city of Philadelphia, again, added to my lens. It is a city that has a large Black community. It is a city that has dealt with a lot of discrimination. It is a city that has dealt with a lot of poverty. And so coming from the West Coast of the United States, where issues of poverty are very, very different than they are in the Northeast. The cities in the Northeast are much older cities. The infrastructure is very different than it is in the West Coast. So again, really building on the lens by which, as I was growing and developing my research program, beginning to think of course, thinking about stress, as Dr. King pointed out, adding to all these things about how it is that mental health is dealt with in this country and the diverse communities and how they have access or don't have access to mental health in this country. Mental health in the United States is a very difficult concept. Mental health is treated in isolation from regular health care. It is oftentimes excluded from insurance policies and practices, and it makes access very difficult in this country. And so that was something that became very clear to me when I was at the University of Pennsylvania, and how thinking about the brain, especially brain development, and how communities lacking resources, how are these children, how are pregnant women, how are moms and dads who'd experienced poverty and trauma going into pregnancy, all of those factors being important. And then I was recruited, as Dr. King said, from Penn down to a state institution. So leaving the Ivy League, coming to the city of Baltimore at the University of Maryland here in Baltimore at the School of Medicine. So the city of Baltimore is a smaller version really of Philadelphia. It is a majority Black city, which in the US means that a majority of the citizens that live and reside in the city of Baltimore are Black. It has a history of many wonderful things that have been contributed to by the emergence of these different populations within the city of Baltimore. There's incredible history of how Baltimore served in many aspects of both the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, all of that. So amazing, beautiful history. We have a beautiful inner harbor here. But what we also have is a history of incredible discrimination and redlining. And it is something that Baltimore is still to this day very much dealing with. And what that has contributed to in the very poor communities that have been neglected, and how they've been really isolated around Baltimore. And that is something, as I was recruited from the University of Pennsylvania down here to this state institution, having to think about so it was in part to start a new center. So based around the research that I do in interests in how stress and trauma affect the child's brain and development, coming to a city where I wanted to start a center that would also engage the community. So rather than just talking amongst ourselves about the importance of stress and building resiliency, engaging the community members so that they understand the value of the biomedical research and how their tax dollars going through the National Institutes of Health back into our research labs. What are the fundamental principles of what we're learning and why it's important? Well, because the city of Baltimore has a history of discrimination. If you've all read the book on Henrietta Lacks, you know the story. That's just one piece of our history here in the city of how this discrimination has affected the Black community and has built up generations of distrust. So this became an immediate, obvious concern for me in putting together a center that would be engaging in the community. How are we going to first build up trust? How are we going to be able to go into the community and establish these conversations in this discussion? And so that is something that was a big focus of my move down here to the University of Maryland, and something that all of the lens by which I developed from a childhood had filtered into and trying to understand and how best to do it. So this is just a map of the United States showing you going from Minnesota to the West Coast, down to the southern part of the country, and then all the way across the country. And that really is spending time in all these different parts of the US has given the lens to by which I think about the research that I do and my obligation and privilege to be a part of this community, and then the worldwide community of all of us that as being president of IBRO serves. So these are maps that I pulled off the web last night. My center is called the Center for Epigenetic Research in Child Health and Brain Development. The epigenetic piece is in there because it really highlights that we're interested not just in how the child's brain develops once conception has happened, but also what happened prior to conception. What happened to moms and dads, life adversity and trauma that may be transmitted at a level of biology, not just at a level of parenting. And so these two maps show you different parts of Baltimore. So if you zoom in to where you see on the left side, the blue and green map there, the city of Baltimore, you can see the blue there is the water where the Chesapeake comes up off the ocean and comes right in, and we call this the inner harbor. And so I actually live down there on the inner harbor. It's a beautiful place to live. But what this has been divided by in this map is the racial distribution across the city. And why that's important is it feeds very much into the conversation of how discrimination has so affected many communities within the city of Baltimore. So as you can see, blue is outlining the mostly white neighborhoods. Green is outlining the mostly Black neighborhoods. There is an interesting area close to Dundalk, which is really across the Chesapeake here, very far out of the main part of the city that's very Asian. We have small Hispanic communities here in East Baltimore, highlighted there in orange. And so historically, over generations, the discrimination really has isolated, as you can see, these sort of wings, we call them, of where the Black communities are within Baltimore. And what has happened is that there's a north and south access to things like public transportation that has made it very difficult for many of these neighborhoods to be able to make it into the city to access resources. And so to me, that is learning a lot about the word equity. You can have all kinds of resources available for communities, but if they don't know about them or can't get to them, that's not equity. And so I think that's very important to think about where these neighborhoods are and how they've become so isolated. And to highlight the diversity and discrepancy as it is to income related to resource access, including things like education. If you look at the map on the right, this is a Baltimore map broken down by home value. And so purple is top 1% of home values, green, high, the gold color average, and then the low home value, of course. And so what you can see very clearly is a lot of that green on the left, which is the majority Black neighborhoods, is also very similar to the very low home values. And that is because of these decades and generations of redlining discrimination practices that we could have a whole separate conversation about, but they have affected very much how the city interacts and the availability of things like healthcare and education, resource access for things like job equity. So those are very much things that, of course, are going to affect the city and these neighborhoods and affect how we interact. And just in terms of engaging with the community of how they perceive who we are and what we're doing. And that's very important. So when I first moved down here and started the center and wanting to take the research that we're doing and move it into the community, one of the first things I did, and a very specific reason why I want to tell you about it, is that I wanted to be able to bring in a speaker who would really drive community interest so I could get visibility for the center, I could engage the community, that it would be an activity that would be, free to the community to attend. And again, looking through the lens that I grew up with and how my experiences were. So I reached out to Nicholas Kristof, who was a journalist for the New York Times, very famous, very well known. If you listen to NPR, which is National Public Radio in the US, everybody knows who he is. And then also he has worked with and previously the commissioner of the Baltimore Health Department, Lena Wen. She's also very famous. She's done a lot throughout the COVID epidemic, and then she's always in the national news. So I reached out to these two individuals. We had them come in. We did an evening thing. We had wine and food. And when I got up on the stage to do Nicholas Kristof's introduction and talk about building a fairer society and his perspective globally. So Nicholas Kristof has traveled the world and written many beautiful books. I highly recommend them. He really talks about the role of women around the world, across everything from in China and in Africa. It's amazing stories that he's written as a journalist with his wife, really phenomenal. As I got up on the stage to introduce these two, I had a moment where I recognized what I hadn't thought about, is that we held this evening event at the Peabody Library. I don't know if you can see in the back there where we're standing. It's this beautiful historic library owned by Johns Hopkins University. It's just amazingly and beautiful. And we had wine and food. And yes, but what I didn't consider, what I hadn't thought about was the community individuals that I wanted to bring in to really have this conversation with. They weren't attending. And because, I'm getting a lot of feedback from somebody's microphone. I'm not sure who that is, sorry. The community members that I wanted to most engage with didn't attend. Why? Because our advertising didn't reach them, because they were intimidated likely to show up at a place like this. It was not their normal neighborhood where they are interested in engaging in conversation. And because Nicholas Kristof, as a New York Times journalist, and Lena Wen, both of them, they're not the people that many of these neighborhoods are going to consider someone speaking about their needs and interests. And so that was an eye-opening moment for me, having to reevaluate the lens that I was looking through. So I took a step back. I reached out to many of my members on campus and those in the community that I've been working with and getting advice and feedback of how to start engaging in the Baltimore community in a way that I was going to connect with the individuals to start the conversations about how we could engage with them in a healthy way. how to build the relationships in Baltimore and improve the potential health outcomes, both in terms of risk and resilience across those influences on the child's brain. So a good starting point for the child's brain is, of course, education, right? That's a great place to start. So starting to think about the Baltimore schools, which I'm not going to get into, but just suffice to say that Baltimore public schools are not great. They struggle tremendously for resources. For those not familiar with how education works in the United States of America, it is usually locally funded through tax dollars. And so the revenue that comes from your state is also a lot of it generated by local property taxes. And so if your properties don't have high value, the schools in your neighborhood are not going to have a lot of resources. And that is a huge problem for the city of Baltimore for many of these neighborhoods. The school buildings are old. They're in a lot of places falling apart. They can't use the drinking water in them because it's full of lead. So all the water fountains are capped off. They're lacking in resources, just essential things like paper towels and soap in the bathroom. And I'm not kidding about this. And so it is a constant ongoing debate in the city. It is a constant debate with our governor in terms of the resources that these schools need. And so, of course, my research and my interest in the center is to really be thinking about how this is impacting the child's brain and their education, because education is everything about the success in your lifetime. And so allowing all children to have equal access to resources is critical for their future health and life success. So I began by engaging with a couple specific schools, because of course I don't have the resources to engage with all of our schools. On the top there, you can see some of these beautiful kids at one of the schools that we engaged with called Callaway Elementary School. This is actually a picture on the top there with our mayor at the time, the Baltimore City Mayor, and I'll come back to that. The other thing I started doing was to be reaching out to the different neighborhoods and communities in ways that I had access to and building on those relationships. The middle picture there on the bottom is actually a picture with City Council member Zeke Cohen. Zeke Cohen is one of the really hugely engaged and very active City Council members developing policies for the city of Baltimore that are impacted by trauma experience. The city of Baltimore is the first city in the United States to pass a Trauma-Informed Care Act. This trauma-informed care mandates that all organizations run that receive any city or state dollars are required to have trauma-informed care training and to be able to use that lens to view how they deal with things like education, housing, incarceration, health department, et cetera. So they do all series of training in the city to allow individuals working with community members to understand if you are a child growing up in a city or have been affected by violence, neglect, abuse, discrimination, all of those events can shape how you interact with your community, whether it be within your schools, within your health, and as you grow and develop. And all of those factors, of course, matter for success. On the right there, I was then invited to present the center to Baltimore City Council. And if you can see there, but the person sitting at the dais on the top there is Brandon Scott, who was the president of City Council. He is now our new mayor. And so it's a great perspective that we're seeing is really this city addressing these issues of discrimination. On the left, I've started working again with our local NPR affiliate to really make sure that the community members all understand the effect across generations. This is some of the work that we started doing in this Callaway Elementary School. And this is actually some of the kids that participated in this program. We really just started this from scratch. I had nothing to build it on. The gentleman here that's showing the brains to these kids, which again, this is the first time they've heard any of this, these children, because they're in these city schools. We're actually doing this activity, as you'll see, in their library. The irony here is that these kids are not allowed to check out the books in this library. Why? Because the school couldn't afford a librarian. So they have all of these books. The children are not allowed to check them out. I mean, it is absolutely crazy making, I will tell you. We ended up calling the program Reading on the Brain. And that is because we wanted to make sure that it was understood that while we're here to talk about the effects of the environment on your brain and how it can affect it, all the way from teaching these kids everything you can see on the bottom there, they're learning about the parts of the brain. We spent the entire school year with these kids. By the end, they had an understanding. These are second, third, fourth, and fifth graders. They had a profound understanding of parts of the brain and why they're important and how they function. I would say that was at easily a college level. It was amazing. They're like sponges, these kids, absorbed it all. The gentleman there is actually a technician from my lab. He got so engaged in these activities that he applied to medical school. And so he left the lab a year ago. And so he's now in medical school and continuing to work and engage in the community. So we did these kinds of activities. We engaged with a local artist so that we could do the science in an interesting, fun way where we could teach them the science. They would learn about it. They would do some science experiments, which who doesn't love a good science experiment? And then we would back up that lesson with cool art. So they didn't have any art classes going on in their school either. So they got that activity as well, really reinforcing it. We brought them into the lab with their parents, which was a super exciting day that they all got to come into downtown Baltimore. They got to go into these labs. They got to do, as you see here, doing a science experiment. They're isolating DNA from fruit and vegetables, which was super fun. They loved it. We had a whole day learning about science and interacting in the lab space. We then, again, now we've started with the kids and the community and the teachers. We wanted to really start to draw in the community and the families. Families tend to be very hesitant to engage in schools. Why? Because many of these children's parents had a horrible experience in their schools and they're very intimidated to come into schools. So we made a really fun family event out of it with food and giveaways. We gave away a membership to the aquarium downtown. We got a huge turnout. In fact, the biggest the school had ever seen. It was wonderful. I love this picture. This little girl was doing a science activity because we had different stations they could rotate through. And this is just, to me, this is like just sheer joy getting to experience the fascination of science right in front of you. So that was fabulous. We then had meetings with all the parents to talk about who we are and what we're doing and answer all of their questions. Again, to begin that conversation with, why is it important that we do biomedical research? What does it matter for them and their families? And then we continued on, as I said, with this art project. So this art project then became all of the kids engaging with, again, the mayor came back in, and we decided we were going to do a mural that was really the message in this school, and thinking about the child's brain and health and how it was important, and that using reading as a way in which this is a positive way you can help your brain, easy, accessible. And so this was one of our messages in this mural. And so every kid in this school, all 300 of them, got to participate with the mayor in painting this mural. And so we had, because we had the mayor there, of course, the local news was interested. So Channel 2 News came in and interviewed these kids. And this is just a picture, which was amazing, of this newscaster interviewing this child who was a third grader. And he started asking him questions about what he's learned about the brain. And this young boy started talking about how when he's really stressed out, he knows it affects his hippocampus. And he's learned throughout the year that his hippocampus, as a response to stress, can impact how he behaves. And so he's learned that he and his cousin, in a very stressful environment, can pick up a couple of the books that they have and sit back and read a book, and that will help eliminate, or at least in that time, reduce the stress and the effect that it's having on us. And this newscaster actually jaw dropped, like his jaw was open to hear these kids talking about their hippocampus. He was sort of a hippo what? It was fabulous. And so that was on the local news and got a lot of attention for the positive story of what can happen in these communities. This is some of the art that became a part of what happens to your brain when you're reading. That was the message we left the kids with. We had a huge ribbon cutting ceremony with the kids. This is their principal and many members of the community and the artists. The CEO of Baltimore City Schools there on the top left, are the dean of our medical school here with the bow tie. They all participated in this. It was an amazing event. This is what the outside of this school looked like when we started. It is not a pretty school. If I showed you the inside, you would be appalled at what the school looked like. At the end of our time, at the end of this year, let me say, and working with this program with the school and the community, this is what their school looked like when we left. And so it's a message. We have constantly had neighbors who don't even have kids in the school stop by and ask us questions, right? So it did exactly what our mission was. Start the conversation and continuing to build on it. So that's what we've been doing. We've continued on. I don't have time to go into all the different projects we're doing in the community, but this was a brain camp that we held in COVID, which was, of course, complicated because of COVID. We took free little library boxes. I don't know if you have them in the country and the areas you live in, but they're all around the United States. These are just free little libraries just put up in parks and people's neighborhoods, and people can just put old used books in them, and then people can take them whenever they want, put other books in them. It's a way to create access. And so we bought a whole bunch of these things, and we had these kids participate in our workshop and then paint them. And those are the boxes you're seeing there. And they are now distributed across the city of Baltimore in all different neighborhoods. Again, continuing this message in the community. For those of you may know that yesterday we also participated in an online National Press Foundation, how to talk to the press. Actually, it was international. We had some people from Africa who were participating that I saw online for the National Press Foundation yesterday, talking about how to talk to the press and the communities about inequality and affecting across generations. And this is one of the last things I want to tell you about, because we're doing this in June. And this will be at the Baltimore Convention Center. We're doing a huge Baltimore Trauma Summit. And this is taking, and actually, Amadi, if you're listening, this is actually something I thought about when I was just in Africa for the SONA meeting, where Amadi brought in people from across the continent of Africa, from different countries, to talk about addiction amongst policymakers and healthcare, et cetera, and what they're seeing across the continent, and then with the scientists. And it was this amazing ability for scientists who study the mechanisms and policymakers to get together. And it really did, it created a great conversation. And so, Amadi, this is what I've taken the center now to do, this exact sort of thing, where day one of the summit brings in our state legislator, our city legislatures, our leadership of our city schools. The dean wants the governor there, but that's a whole separate story. I don't really care to have him here. But anyway, so bringing in all these legislators who make policy, but need to understand that there's a science behind trauma, but then have the scientists there who spend a lot of time in sort of in our ivory towers, thinking a lot about the research and in cell culture and mouse models, but don't really understand necessarily what the community is dealing with. And so it's a mix on day one of both. And then day two is really going to take that, bring in funding membership from NIH, and talk about the science. How can science be better informed by what's happening in the community? So that's coming up in June. And this is actually just what my lens now has been further shaped by being president of IBRO. And everything from the opportunity and privilege of getting to travel. So I was just at the SONA meeting in Ghana back in October, and I had the amazing opportunity to hear all the diverse science that is going on the continent of Africa, to interact with the Brain Bee kids from Africa, which was a real privilege. You can see the sash that Amadi had made for me. In fact, if you can see in my background, it's actually hanging here in my office. And the African Regional Committee, we had a great meeting also at this, at the SONA meeting. That was fabulous. And on the right was actually the EBBS meeting, which was in Switzerland. And again, shaping of early career stage, the shaping of my lens through the perspective of what early career stage neuroscientists are experiencing. So those are just two examples, again, of, we can do this on Zoom and sometimes we have to, but I will say really getting together, visiting the SONA meeting, just really getting to talk to the individuals working across the continent of Africa, what's going on, what their needs are, what the resources that they need, just having greater transparency of how decisions are being made and what the needs are, incredibly helpful in understanding my role as president of IBRO. Okay, so that's the quick perspective on my story of what I do in the community and how it got there. And I just want to quickly take that same lens now and how I apply it to research, because I think it's important for us all to recognize that our experiences are shaped, and how we sit down and write a grant, how we design a research experiment is shaped by our lens and our experiences of how we view, how we develop a hypothesis, and how we might see the outcomes and results. Okay, so I love this slide because it really highlights the dynamic and significant effect that COVID has had. This is actually old data. I didn't have time to swap it out for the new CDC data, but just look at those differences for symptoms. This is just for the US, symptoms of anxiety, and the middle there is depression, and then the combination of anxiety and depression, diagnosed going from pre-COVID to during COVID, if you look at the dates there, going from January up through December of 2020. Look how rapidly the presentation of anxiety and depression escalated. And that to me is something that is so important to think about. I don't care if you're in a mouse model or doing cohort research in human beings or just engaged in a community. The escalation around the world, because everybody's baseline from wherever you started on that hill has been shifted. And so when new things happen and everybody's baseline is already very high, it pushes people over the edge in terms of disease presentation. I think that's something we need to be very mindful of. But for my research, it really made me continue to think about how does the developing brain, how is it shaped, preconception environment, in pregnancy and postpartum, that you can, the risk and the resilience for how you respond to these challenges. And that's so important. If you add on to that, sex is a biological variable, and you break down that data I just showed you, you can clearly see that the impact of COVID has been very much higher felt by women, especially women of childbearing age or children with children at home, for all the obvious reasons of caretaking around the world. There's additional data that if you take that one step further, that not only is it just women, but of course, again, sorted by race and our most vulnerable populations, again, due to lack of resources, are the ones most affected by COVID. So if you take the environment we're currently living in and add to that the risk because of all that happened up until this point for your brain, that is the research that I'm most interested in discovering. So studying risk and resilience, this is actually a slide I used at the SONA meeting, but I love it because when you think about a tree, which to me also resembles very much that of a neuron, we think about everything that we can see above ground. But what we may not think about is everything happening below ground, and the stability of that tree. It's very symbolic of risk and resilience. How stable is the ground? How elaborate is the root system? How long has the tree been growing? What is around the tree? All of those things are very analogous to how we as individuals think about our research, but also our ability to cope in our environment. So I love the African proverb of the wind does not break a tree that bends. We spend a lot of time thinking about disease and risk. We sometimes forget about what builds resilience. And I think that's just equally important, but also thinking about good African proverbs. I was reminded of this when I was at SONA meeting in Africa, as to be humble, because even a large tree can be taken down by a small axe. So I think that's also important when we are in leadership roles and we have these opportunities as leaders around the world, and how we interact with early stage investigators, how we interact with our communities, that we need to also be humble and really be able to take the perspective of seeing things through other individuals' lens and not just our own. So this, if you take nothing away from the science I'm going to talk about, is the lens by which I think about our science and risk or resilience for neuropsychiatric disease. I'm going to lump all neuropsychiatric disease together here. So depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, autism, all of them together, and that it is always your G by E by D, your genetic risk that you inherit from mom and dad, of which you can do nothing about, your environment. That could be mom and dad's environment passed on by their preconception experiences. That can be environment by which developing in the maternal milieu of gestation. That could be the environment that you're experiencing right now. By developmental windows, meaning is the impact of environment, be it a reward-based environment or a risk-based environment, does that occur during gestation? Well, that's going to have a very different impact on the brain than it is if it happened during, say, puberty, of the brain regions that might be affected and how they're affected, right? So G by E by D. Sex as a biological variable, I will remind you all, is critical at all of these things. Sex is very specific about genes because you have the X and Y chromosome. And that's really important for everything for how the brain develops and matures, to everything about the placenta during pregnancy. So sex, very important for genes. Of course, it may determine a lot about how you perceive your environment and the environments you will be in. And of course, it determines a lot about rates of development and maturation. So that in a nutshell is how I think about the research that we do. And as Dr. King pointed out, we spend a lot of time in my lab thinking about the germ cell, breaking this all the way down to the very basic parts of two cells coming together at conception. And how do they pass on effects that may in addition to the DNA, augment or shut down risk and resilience in the development of the brain. So again, all of these factors important for a child's brain development could be the germ cells coming together, mom's environments, mom's biology, et cetera. And of course, the placenta being very important. So I just want to tell you one quick story that is the result of a lot of our biological research in animal models and cell culture and how we took that into humans. And the one thing that has come out of decades of research in the lab is that we've been able to identify one specific biomarker, is what we're calling it, and that is extracellular vesicles. Okay, we call this the translational and reverse translational because we start with animal models, we've gone into humans, we found really interesting human outcomes, and we're taking them back into animals. So what is an extracellular vesicle? An extracellular vesicle is a nanoparticle. It is secreted into circulation in all mammals and from all tissues. So all of your tissues in your body are constantly secreting these nanoparticles. They come from their cell derived. They come from different parts of the cell. They are of different sizes, as you see on the bottom there. There's microvesicles, there's exosomes, there's apoptotic bodies, there's all different types of them. The cargo that they have, as you can see from the left side, are small non-coding RNA, especially microRNA, and then tons of proteins. And these travel in circulation. They're basically a way, think of them as sort of like the endocrine system, right? They're secreted into circulation and they're traveling somewhere, trying to convey a homeostatic message. Okay, so just quickly, this is all published. You can look all this up. If you do not have access and you're interested, let me know. I'm happy to send it out as a PDF. So this is looking at biomarkers. We were able, in a collaboration with Tanya Jovanovic Group as a part of the Grady Trauma Project in Atlanta, another majority Black city, we wanted to ask the question, if you experience a specific type of trauma during a specific window of time, were we able to look at health outcomes specifically to that timing and as well as changes in this biomarker? I'm very much simplifying the study here just for the sake of time. So the answer is yes, we were. And we were able to divide, this was all women. These women are now in their late 30s, early 40s. They experienced a specific type of trauma, sexual trauma, or a form of interpersonal violence. And they either experienced it before the age of 14, so before adolescence, specifically in adolescence between 14 and 17, or over the age of 18, so as an adult, or they had no sexual trauma at all. We had decent numbers in all of these groups, 25 to 28 women in each of these groups. And so these women, this is like decades after their sexual trauma experience. And now we're asking, is there a way of looking at these nanoparticles in circulation of these women currently that can define their risk for health outcomes? And so the answer is yes, we were. And I'm going to tell you quickly, why do EVs matter? So I'm not going to go into all the details, but just to tell you that there's lots of ways we can characterize extracellular vesicles in humans that are the same as characterizing them in mouse models, et cetera. So the size of vesicles matters, the charge, how they interact with other surfaces matters. It matters for their biology. So on the bottom there, what I'm showing you is that when we isolated from blood plasma from these women, we were able to show that the size of the vesicle mattered for when the trauma happened. So if you look at this, the women who experience trauma between 14, so as adolescents, is significantly reduced in size compared to all other groups. And then if you look at what's called the zeta potential, the charge of these vesicles on average, it is significantly less. It's more neutral. And what that means is it's less stable, more likely to be degraded. So what this data tells us is that one, yes, we can see differences specific to when this trauma happened in general circulation. And the biology here now tells us we should move forward. It may be meaningful for actions of these vesicles. So the next thing we did was we took all of these vesicle samples and we did an omics approach. We looked at proteomics, looking at all of the proteins in these groups. The heat maps on the top are just showing you by color. Towards the blue end is showing you abundant proteins. Toward the red end is showing you less abundant or undetectable proteins in these groups, okay? So on the top there in E are the non-sexual trauma control women here, averaging across everybody who experienced sexual trauma on the bottom. So you can see overall, there's a lot of different proteins. And that's probably because these EVs being secreted all the time, and you remember all the time, as you're experiencing your environment, they may be coming from different tissues at different rates, and that's why there's different proteins. But interesting, and one story I want to leave you with, if we break this down by when that trauma happened, you can see that this one group here of proteins that are very blue, very abundant, and only were detected in that one group that experienced the trauma in adolescence. And what were they? They were a ton of proteins that were all based around keratins. So keratins in your skin and nails and hair, these type of proteins, keratin-associated proteins, keratin type 1 and type 2, et cetera. Well, that was interesting and something we hadn't thought of before. So we spent a lot of time diving into what is the similarity, showing you here in this bubble plot. This one group had all of these proteins not detected in EVs in any of the other women. On the right, I'm showing you is what we determined was, well, you know what they all had in common? Almost all of these proteins, their genes were part of a 17q21 gene cluster. And that's fascinating because gene clusters tend to be regulated in a similar way. Now giving us the evidence that maybe when you experience the trauma may have altered the epigenetics of this cluster. And that's why we're seeing these EVs from these tissues being secreted in high abundance. Two other genes that have been identified from the GWAS, genome-wide association studies for PTSD risk, ironically, the corticotropin releasing factor receptor, your stress receptor, and MAP2, these two genes also in this cluster. So really, from an unbiased omics approach, starting to give us the direction of what we can further study as to who might be at risk and why that's important. Because your skin is your greatest defense barrier, right? It is the one organ that protects you from all changes in your environment, psychological or physical. And there is actually a local stress axis similar to that found in your brain, also found in your skin. Many of the same components, the same receptors, the same peptides, amazingly. So we started thinking more about that and the proteins involved. I'm not going to go into all the details about this, but there is one unique cell type in the skin responsible for tactile. If you lightly touch your skin, the Merkel cell, which is many of the proteins we identified here, is isolated from the differentiation of that one cell type in the skin. And that is your the mechanical sensory skin cells. You may have heard of it because the recent Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine was awarded in part to Artem Patapoutian, who is the one who discovered the Merkel cell. So that may be familiar to many of you. So all the way from this unbiased approach in women, from this one specific question from many of our studies, we are now drilled down to, is there something unique about light touch that aligns with this particular type of sexual trauma? These cells are fascinating. They are the only neuronal-like skin cell. They actually secrete norepinephrine, and they do that to what are known as A beta fibers that respond to these Merkel cells. And the final maturation stage of the differentiation of these cells from keratinocytes, that's in the kind of the background there I'm showing you, those keratinocytes, they differentiate over time. Their final maturation occurs during adolescence, the time which we see that a traumatic event seems to have programmed them. So that's something that we can now follow up on and thinking about health risk. This is all the data from these women. I'm not going to go into all of it for timing, but we did identify that the timing of this trauma put one group of women at risk for things like obesity, diabetes, and hypertension. This other group of women experiencing it during adolescence, the data I've just shown you, at great risk for PTSD, fear potentiated startle, skin conductance, unique to this group of women. So now we can follow up and ask bigger questions, different types of trauma, different timing events in women and men, and ask about the regulation. And then we can take, this is actually from a grant that the NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health, just funded this giant grant that we're working now as a outcome of these studies to do both another cohort of women in Detroit, another majority Black city in the US, a 30-year cohort that's been, so women that were recruited in pregnancy and followed for 30 years. So them, their kids, and now their grandkids. It's a wealth of information that we can learn a lot about PTSD. And then we can look at mechanistically in mice. I'm not going to go through this data, but we've been able to develop a very similar timing of chronic stress and effects in a mouse model that allows us to ask everything from the skin sensitivity. We can use transgenic animals to look at the changes around the same gene cluster, et cetera. So now we've taken it again from the human back into the mouse. And we can ask really specific questions to understand, again, risk and how to build more resilience. And so I'm going to end there. I hope that I was able to make clear that the importance of the G by E by D, when it happens, what it affects, what we can learn from it. And hopefully our mouse studies can also really, really identify biomarkers. Imagine if we could take pregnant women and understand, especially those that are the most vulnerable, who might be at the greatest risk for things like preterm birth, and then finding novel ways and interventions to prevent really the known increase in maternal and fetal and infant morbidity and mortality. So those are things that we're working on in other grants as well. So I am happy to take any questions, Jean. I know we're kind of short on time, but anything that anybody wants to discuss, I'm here to discuss.
That was amazing. Thank you so much for an
I do want to make sure that I've highlighted all of the members of the lab and all of our collaborations that have participated in all the different research I didn't have time to talk about, but their names are all on here. I've been so fortunate to have incredible talent. Katie Morrison is the postdoc on the studies that I just told you about. And she was the first author on those studies. She's now an assistant professor in West Virginia. So she really drove a lot of those studies. But again, all of our collaborations and support through NIH, again, framing the important lens for early career stage investigators and where they go from here.
No, thank you. And it's not like you not to share everybody in your lab. So thank you for taking that. Very Tracy. Okay, so Sonia, you have a question.
Yes, thank you so much. This is great. I am actually also faculty at UMSOM, Department of Psychiatry, so I'm proud to be associated with you that way. I had a question regarding some of the community outreach work you do.
Yes.
Do you have some ideas on how to involve trainees in that kind of stuff? So what I'm aiming to do, so I'm actually located at the MPRC, Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. Yep, and I'm trying to kind of implement a summer program for trainees all the way from undergrad to—
Brilliant, great. Yeah, great.
So, I mean, one of the things that I would like to implement is the community outreach aspect. So if you have any tips on how to involve trainees in that, that would be great. And I'll probably follow up with you over email.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. So one, I'm gonna just give a shout out. So the MPRC, for those who don't know, it's the University of Maryland School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry's Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, and it actually is on the campus of this state hospital, state mental hospital. It has its share of issues, part of which is the research facility itself is a bit old. And so in the state institution and the campus, and so that's one of the issues you're going to face there. But they're looking for a new director and they're interviewing candidates right now. And so it's a great opportunity to connect with the new director. I know, because I happen to be married to the chair of physiology here, who's part of that search. And I know that he has brought it up to all of the candidates. How much are they engaged with communities? Do they care about, and especially vulnerable populations? So there's your segue there with the new director.
That's definitely been one of my questions as we've met the candidates. So
Yep, it's really important.
Sorry, I hate to rush you along, but I have 3 more questions that we quickly have to get.
Sorry, yes, I don't
know
the whole time.
Follow up online. That sounds great. Pam, I think you had your hand up, and yes.
I'm trying to find. Okay, there we go. Anyway, that was just really an inspiring, amazing talk on so many levels with so many questions. One of the things I loved was that when you're working in the schools, you actually gave these kids tools to use, and the kids were able to talk about their hippocampus. And I sort of had a similar question with Sonia, like, how do we as scientists, this is a huge question, like engage in the community, but a smaller question is, what other tools were you giving them? Like, that was a great tool that the kid was talking about, reading. So I just wondered if there are other things you could talk about that you told them to use.
Yeah. So like I said, I was basically in the early stages of this center flying by the seat of my pants, right? There was, I mean, looking for structures that already exist. And that is my biggest piece of advice. If you're going to engage in a community, start with what already exists, because the worst thing you can do is just go in like you're the first show in town, because one, it offends people, but two, right, you're not going to utilize the resources that already exist. And so lots of lessons to be learned there, constantly listening rather than talking at different groups, right? It's great to say, here we are and we're here to engage, but first listening. So I started with a listening tour, going out and listening to where and trying, and not to lump everybody together, because not every neighborhood is the same, certainly not. And so trying to figure out, okay, we want to engage in this neighborhood. What is the history? What has been done? What are the resources that already exist? What are the gaps? What could be helpful? Even for the children in the schools, understanding where are they coming from? Do they live in these neighborhoods? Are they bussed in? Where do they go home? What are the resources? What's the aftercare program and before care program? So understanding all of that first, and then trying to figure out what the resources are that we could be helpful with. And so we had a lot of ideas that we were very wrong about, right? So one, the book thing, but then finding out like, wait, you have this library, but the kids can't check out books? Are you kidding me? I almost went to the length of saying like, I will come volunteer. This is crazy. How could kids not have access to books? So rather figuring out, okay, well, if they don't, how can we get them books? How can we get them access to the local public library, right, outside of the school? Things like that. So those are the resources we started working with, figuring out what they do really need, rather than giving them shiny baubles that really are not going to be useful to many of these kids. And then building on the structure of, well, they aren't learning about art. Let's add that, because that just supports the science, et cetera. So those are things we just sort of went by flow. And then I will tell you, when taking it to another school, some of the things translated and some things didn't. And you kind of have to start over again, because different communities, different kids.
I know. So Ulma, you had your hand up for a long time. So I want to get to your question.
Thank you so much. I'm here. I'm just in Colombia, and I'm glad to be here and listen this very wonderful talk. Thank you, Tracy. And my question is related with maternal bonding and this kind of vesicles as biomarkers, because in Colombia we have a huge problem related with the adolescents that get pregnant, but after they have to work, they are not really prepared to be mothers. And on top of that, we have like the grandmother, the mother, the daughter, and all of them are single mothers. I mean, they don't have the boy or the father working in this how to say, the relation of the family. So do you think that these vesicles could be a good markers to see how we can approach in the basic science the social reality, to see if we have?
That's a really great question. That's like a big picture question. So first I'm going to say those issues that you're discussing for your community are very much similar issues that we have here in the city of Baltimore. And it informs a lot of things to think about how again, you're engaging with the grandmother generation, which is going to be very different messaging and conversation than the daughter and granddaughter, right? I think that's really important. As biomarkers, I mean, I guess it depends on what your question is, of your biomarker of what. So predictive of something, status for something, trying to prevent, for instance, preterm birth, which is a huge factor in the US. So I guess it depends on your question of what biomarker.
The first part is could be a biomarker to predict that behavior in all the girls, no? And the second is if those could be possible, that those biomarkers help us to see how can we approach the next generation.
Yeah. I think that's going to be a couple steps removed from a biomarker. I think you're really looking for things that are societal norms.
Yeah.
and being able to address the issue in younger girls as to what the impact of having children early, not having having that single mom and the stressor of that. I mean, that's kind of what we were directing at the kids in the school and talking about. Here's the right, but you don't want to just have a negative message. So that's what we use books and reading as a resource available positive message as well, something that they have control over. And that's what the kids really embraced, was having something that they can control at that age that helps inform the decisions they make later. Right?
Yes, education.
Controlling your behavior was a concept that we really drilled on at every one of our lessons. Yes, of course you're going to react when somebody makes you mad, or when somebody, right? This is one of the big problems in cities like Baltimore, where the escalation to violence. So teaching kids, yes, of course you're going to feel bad, but you have control over your brain. And we worked a lot of that, of controlling emotions and not escalating. And so I think working through those sorts of things is worked out well, I think, for messaging for the kids.
For the social. Evelyn, I see you have your hand up. Thank you.
Yes. Tracy, thank you. This was a wonderful talk and very inspiring what you're doing. Couple of a comment and a question. The comment is, what I really appreciated is that in your engagement with the community, you actually giving something to them and not necessarily trying to get something back in return. Sometimes that in minority communities, the distrust comes with the fact that they feel that they're being exploited.
Yep.
And I didn't get that at all from what you.
Well, that is a very big problem, Emmeline, in the city of Baltimore.
Yeah, exactly. So, my question is that just following on what Pam mentioned, you chose reading. Immediately, what came to my mind, because of my interest in the topic, is music. So that would be another interesting focus to explore. We just funded a grant actually that's looking at an after-school intensive music training program. Absolutely. As a way to impact on inhibitory control regions of the brain. So so there's a lot of stuff that could be done there. I'd love to talk to you about that.
So I will just tell you a little snippet that one of the things that this particular school, even though these things again are nationwide mandated and statewide mandated, you must have art, you must have recess. If you don't have the resources, the kids don't get them. So they don't, but they did. This school happened to have a music class. And how I know that is because we played music every day for exactly the reason that you're saying, as a way of calming down the end of the day, because we did a lot of this stuff after school, calming down, stressful day. I could tell you stories that would make your head spin of some of the things happening all day long in the school. There's a lot of yelling because the kids have been raised in an environment where the only way you get attention is by yelling. And then the teachers are yelling to try to get the kids' attention. It's a lot of yelling. And I would walk out of there like just stressed every day. So the music, absolutely. Reading and music hand in hand. One day, as we're playing music, so our art, this famous art artist in the Baltimore community, J. Wolf Schlossberg Cohen, he's got murals all around the country and around the world, actually. He's amazing. He volunteers, part of our program. He would play different kinds of music, and then he would kind of quiz the kids. And I would be like, oh my God, Jay, why would they be able to discern? And they did. I mean, they knew. And again, kind of, I think, through their own, and so this is the important thing of understanding the neighborhoods you're dealing with. Like, they knew through their own generations of, they could discern between different types of jazz, different types. I mean, I was blown away by, so they very much already knew. And so then, yes, it was easy to take that and say, well, hey, guess what it's doing to your brain?
Excellent.
It was a great message.
Thank you.
All right, we have run over, but I think this was something we really wanted to hear all of. And there's one last question I saw from Annabelle in the chat that I really just wanted to at least let you know about. It says, have you seen maternal biomarkers in moms that are users of drugs of abuse that might differ from stress biomarkers?
Yeah, so different types of stress. This is something that questions that we get often. We haven't done them because first we sort of needed to validate, but there's a lot of interest, especially with the opioid addiction crisis in the US. But, you know, as Amadi showed at SONA, different types of addiction across, you know, other countries and continents, very much something of interest because it affects mom's health, but could also be a predictor of things of fetal health and brain development. So it's a great question. Don't have an answer for that yet, but something I know more and more EV work is coming out. So absolutely, yeah.
So if everyone could quickly turn on their screens, if they're able to, we'll take a quick picture to literally have this moment that we could test. Martha is probably better at pictures than I am, but I'm gonna try. And again, we want to give a big round of applause to Professor Louie. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. So those of you who would want to turn on your cameras for a little bit so we could
I would love to do a tweet out but I see everybody's beautiful faces. Where's
everybody?
Everybody?
I know. Love to see the faces here. Elaine, Amadi, Oli, whoever could turn on their screens for a little bit. There you go. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. And again, Tracy, thank you. It was wonderful.
It was wonderful.
Thank you all.
Everybody,
Thank you all
so WWN, if you're not a member, please look for us at our website, join us. Oli is probably going to reach out to you, to those of you who literally came in and registered for this but are not members. And to all of our members, it was so great to see you. Thank you so much. We'll be following up soon. Have a good one.
Thank
Bye,
you all.
everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.